All right, well, welcome everybody. So this is session 29 of the Philosophers in the Midst of History. And this is the 10th year of this quarterly series here at the Frank Weinberg Library. So some of you are repeat customers, we could say. So you already know how we do this. We have an ancient, a medieval, early modern, which is what we're doing today, and then a late modern thinker each quarter. And so today we're going to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, somebody who I've been pretty interested in for, I would say, about a decade and a half. Not somebody who actually got taught when I was in school, but I incorporate her into a lot of my classes because I think what she has to say is very helpful. I think a lot of people probably know her more because of her more famous daughter, Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, among other works, not all of which are as good as Frankenstein, frankly. But Mary Wollstonecraft was somebody quite important in her own right. And as we're going to talk about with the sort of story of her life and her death and the work after that, she kind of got set to the side, unfortunately, for quite some time, mainly due to her well-meaning but not very thoughtful in this respect husband, William Godwin, who wrote a biography of her. So she's considered what they call a first-wave feminist, and she's all about trying to make society, which at that time was very unequal, in many respects more equal, to create opportunities for women, to open doors. She wasn't into quite a few of the concerns that contemporary feminism often is focused on, and so she sometimes gets viewed as a bit of a stick in the mud in that way, or too old-fashioned. But I think she's actually got a lot to recommend her, and not just as a feminist thinker, but as like a hard-hitting virtue ethicist. You can make a case that she's a very important 18th century virtue ethicist and social theorist. She also wrote essays, letters. She wrote a few novels that are worth checking out as well. And so the historical context, what we do in all these presentations is we're trying to situate the person within the history that they developed within and then they contributed to. So her historical context, the 18th century, is often called the Enlightenment in English, or the siècle des Lumières in French, which means like the century of luminaries, lights, people like that, Aufklärung in German. And so there's this incredible ferment that's going on intellectually, the development of what you could call, as some people have, a public sphere. So everything from publishing pamphlets that you would like nail onto the wall and people would walk by and actually read them and debate about them, to coffee house culture. Coffee houses were viewed as subversive at that time, believe it or not. So people would go in, drink their coffee, and then talk politics or utopian schemes or things like that. Salons. People are writing letters back and forth to each other. There was something that was called the Republic of Letters, like spanning Europe, that Wollstonecraft was part of, but so many other thinkers were as well. There's lots of technological developments that are taking place. The Industrial Revolution is starting to take off, particularly in Britain, which is where Wollstonecraft spends most of her life. And there's also a lot of economic expansion. This is a century of colonialism, of big wars between European powers that are jockeying for position. England becomes a dominant power in the world at that time, rivaled by France, as we're going to talk about in a bit. Spain is kind of going into decline at that time. Italy is still fragmented, so is Germany, although Prussia is slowly starting to rise. and Russia is becoming a big concern as well. And this is the century that sees the 7 Years' War, a massive, battle taking place within Europe itself, and also what we call over here the French and Indian War, which was sort of an extension of it. And all these powers are jockeying with each other. And then we're going to see revolutions. So, we think about the American Revolution happening in 1776. That's kind of smack dab in the middle of her life. And then another revolution that's going to be massively important in her life is the French Revolution, much more radical than the American Revolution. There's the Haitian Revolution taking place shortly after that as well. And there's a number of people that you may or may not know, just to give you some points of comparison. Intellectual life, as I mentioned, is really taking off. So Wollstonecraft is born in 1759. 4 years earlier, Samuel Johnson, who she met later on, publishes the Dictionary of the English Language. This is we take these dictionaries for granted, right? Oh, what's a dictionary? It's not a big deal. Well, having like a standard reference thing with all of these entries, and just imagine all the work that went into it, that was pretty important. It's standardizing the language. It's giving you a sense of like how words are supposed to be used. We have the French Encyclopedia, which is subtitled The Systematic Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Crafts. And this is a massive project that's happening over in France, specifically mostly in Paris. And it's headed by Denis Diderot and Jean de Leron d'Alembert. They end up producing 28 volumes of all of these articles on various topics. They get in trouble with the monarchy. They get shut down and relocate their presses at one point. And that's going to go from 1751 to 1772. So a 21-year span of all of this stuff coming out. Adam Smith, you probably know for his The Wealth of Nations, but his arguably more important work at the time is the Theory of Moral Sentiments. That comes out in 1762. It's part of what we call the Scottish Enlightenment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is going to publish The Social Contract and Emile, both in the same year. Immanuel Kant will publish The Critique of Pure Reason in 1790. Edmund Burke, you may have heard of him. He was somebody that Wollstonecraft went after and arguably did some damage to as well. In 1790 is writing his reflections on the revolution in France. Somebody who's on the opposite spectrum, Thomas Paine, who we know as an important theorist here in America because of his common sense. He publishes a work called The Rights of Man, and he's sort of on the radical end when it comes to the French Revolution. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on, and Wollstonecraft is, growing up within this, and she's growing up in London. So she is born to this guy, Edward John Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Dixon, and her father is kind of a screw-up, He's into get-rich-quick schemes, which I don't know if any of you have ever participated in them. You generally don't get rich. Somebody else gets rich, but not you. You're the mark. And so the family was pretty poor. They had to move around. Mary is the oldest daughter, so she's the second oldest of all the children. She gets a lot of responsibility placed on her shoulders, and her dad is actually abusive to the family. There's a little quip from William Godwin. He said, her father was a man of quick, impetuous disposition, subject to alternate fits of kindness and cruelty. In his family, he was a despot, and his wife appears to have been the first and most submissive of his subjects. The mother's partiality was fixed on the eldest son, as you can imagine, and her system of government relative to Mary was characterized by considerable rigor. Oldest kid very often gets the disciplining parenting, right? And then it goes on, she at length, the mother, became convinced of her mistake and adopted a different plan with her younger daughters. So the younger daughters get a little bit more easy treatment, maybe spoiled a bit. And Mary is going to go to what they call day schools at the time, so she's not going to a boarding school because they can't afford anything like that. And she's trying to pick up like any education she can. There's not a lot of opportunities, but she's fortunate in who she becomes friends with. So she gets connected with Fanny Blood, who's 2 years older than her, and she will actually spend quite a lot of time with them. She becomes friends with Jane Arden and spends time in their family. And these are people who have books where she can read. She can learn from them. And by the time that she's 19, she's going to become a companion, basically a gopher, and an ear for a widow lady, Mrs. Dawson of Bath, and will do that for about 2 years. Her mother will become ill. Mary will be the dutiful daughter, go home, take care of her mom, and she'll move in after that with Fanny Blood's family. Her sister Eliza will get married, and she'll move in 1783 with her sister Eliza. She has a kid, so she moves in to help her after the childbirth. And they're going to actually begin a school. So that's a project with her sisters and Fanny. And this is a way to make money. This is a way to actually earn a living. There's no dowry for her. There's no other real opportunities, but she's one of the first one of the first women who's going to make a living as an author in England. Not independently wealthy. She's actually going to earn a living. But first she's starting schools. That is a good way to bring in some cash, and it's a good thing. While she does that, she's going to start meeting people, including Samuel Johnson. None of this probably would have happened if she wasn't in London. If she was located somewhere else like York or some other town, unless she was in Edinburgh, in which case that was a pretty happening city as well. She's going to do some more nursing as Fanny becomes ill. Fanny goes to Portugal. It was often change of venue was often prescribed as something that could help you out. So Portugal's a nice place to go. And Fanny is going to get ill with pulmonary consumption. Mary will nurse her there. In the meantime, the school fails because the sisters don't have the wherewithal to really keep it going. So she's going to become a governess. And that's another way you could earn a living at the time if you were an independent, thoughtful young woman. And she's going to begin her writing career at that point. So her first book it's not really that groundbreaking. She writes thoughts on the education of daughters. There are some sort of prefigurations of her most famous work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, that are going to come up in that. The idea that women are rational beings, which a lot of people didn't believe at the time, including many women. The importance of moral development for both sexes. The problematic of what she calls bad education, and her notion of education includes not just like schooling, but work, culture, all of these things that go into forming our minds. And she's engaging with some of the educational theory of the time, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile, John Locke's, he's an earlier English philosopher, his remarks concerning education, but also this Hester Chapon's letters on the improvement of the mind, which again is focused on treating women as rational agents. So she's she's not like the complete groundbreaker. Nobody's ever thought that women could do things like this before her. She's drawing on previous women's work, but she's going to be consolidating it in an important way. And then she, we could talk about the next phase of her life starting around 1787. So she decides that she's going to become a professional author. Now, that at the time is pretty unique for a woman to do. There were male professional authors, people who earned their living by writing, translating, going on tours and things like that. But no woman was doing that as an independent means of existence at that time. There were plenty of women authors who had, rich husbands or their own wealth, and they could do that as sort of a sideline. They could have a salon or something like that. She doesn't have that. So she does it in a very smart way. So she's going to first see that there's a market. And the market is for translating works from various languages, other European languages, into English. Because there's all this cool stuff happening in other places. So she learns French improves the French that she knows and German, and she starts translating works. And translating is really great to do. That's something that I do on my part. I really enjoy translating because you don't have to have any original thoughts of your own. You get to enjoy the original thoughts of the person you're trying to give voice to, right? But it is challenging trying to figure out, okay, so this French phrase, how can I convey this to a Frenchless English reader with the least amount of miscommunication possible, right? It's a challenge, it's a puzzle. So she's exercising her mind doing this, and she's doing it for this guy. And again, she's kind of fortunate she ran into the Joseph Johnson, who is a publisher and editor. And, if he had been more of a conservative, maybe he wouldn't have hired her. But he brings her on to translate and to write articles. And so this is like an apprenticeship program, you could say. And you notice what happens by looking at the timeline shortly after that. She brings out one of her first, let's call it, narrative writings. Mary, a fiction. This is a novel. It's interesting to read. It's very 18th century. So you might get a little, bored with the pace or the framing of it, reading it today. But I actually think it's quite good. And then original stories from real life. Right? So there's a market for the kind of thing that she's doing. And then what happens? The French Revolution. It's a huge world-shaking event. France at the time it's not just a monarchy, it's a corrupt monarchy. And there's all these other things going on. You've got all these nobles who were kind of defanged by two kings before, Louis XIV, who's gathering them essentially like parasites to Versailles and taking them away from their lands. Why? Because otherwise they revolt. Louis XIV actually had to leave France when he was a kid or a young man because of a revolt. And so he's like, that's not going to happen anymore. And so you've got all these guys and women who are living off of everybody else's work. The clergy is pretty messed up in France as well. There's a lot of overlap between the nobility and the clergy. Taxes are incredibly high. The poorer you are, the more you're paying in taxes. Things like salt was taxed, necessities for people. So, eventually there's a revolution, and they want to figure out what to do and how should they change society. And not everybody agrees about precisely what ought to be done. And around the same time, Mary is going to get involved with this guy, Henry Fuseli, who's a painter. She's got a sort of romantic entanglement with him. He's married, and she will actually suggest a rather unorthodox arrangement to him that I suppose now we would call it a throuple. She suggests that he and his wife and her should all live together and love each other, and they reject that idea. And so she winds up, moving out of their circles. She publishes another work, the Female Reader, and then she's going to get involved eventually with William Godwin. Let's not get involved. Let's say cross paths with William Godwin. But before this, Edmund Burke, who we mentioned before, is writing about this terrible revolution that's happening in France. And so Mary Wollstonecraft is going to bring her first book of social theory out, The Vindication of the Rights of Men. So Vindication of the Rights of Women is sort of a companion piece to that, but it winds up being the stronger piece. But her response to Burke is actually quite interesting. She is arguing, against his political views. He was a conservative. They thought that, getting rid of the king is a terrible idea. You really need to have a stable monarchy. Everybody should know their place. And Mary Wollstonecraft is saying, no, human beings need to have greater opportunities to be able to, some social mobility. And somebody shouldn't be in charge just because they happen to be born into the right family. They should, it should be based on merit and education and the amount of virtue. So that's establishing her reputation. And she's going to meet William Godwin. Now, William Godwin's a philosopher, right? So he's not just some guy walking in off the street and saying, oh, this lady's pretty and intelligent. I'll go and chat with her. He's thinking that she's very smart. She's also, in his eyes, very attractive. And looking at the paintings of her, I'd say that she was as well. And what ends up happening is she argues with him basically the whole night. They're at a party, and you know how you go off when you're at a party. You're like, let's go chat over here. So they do that, and like each thing that he brings forward, she's got a response to it. So he's not doing very well with this, and he ends up saying, "Oh, well, that's a disappointment," and I don't think he probably thinks much about her after that, and it doesn't seem like she thinks an awful lot about him after that either. But later on he's going to read her letters, and that's going to be quite important as well. So what's going to happen after that? She's going to leave for Paris. And why is she doing that? Well, she's quite interested in what is going on over there. She's going to write the book that she's most famous for, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. We'll talk about why. I'll give you like a little brief thing. There's a proposal to provide universal education in France. So public education. However, that's only for men or male students. Women, girls should get a domestic education. And so, Mary Wollstonecraft looks at this, and this is actually the French Minister of Education who is, proposing this. And she's like, that's a stupid idea, and I'm going to tell you why. Here's a whole book providing you with my thoughts on that, as well as a bunch of other related topics. That's the Vindication of the Rights of Women. And so it's occasioned, but it's also an important piece in its own right, you could say. And so, by this time when she leaves for Paris and, winds up there, she's getting there as things are really heating up. The king is executed. She actually sees the execution, finds herself moved. She says, I found the tears flowing insensibly from my eyes when I saw Louis sitting with more dignity than I expected from his character in a coach going to meet death, right? And he's far from the only person being guillotined at the time. By 1793, France and Britain are at war, so she is a foreign national living in France while things are sliding more and more in a radical direction. We're getting to the point of the terror and the revolutionaries kind of eating each other. You could say not literally, but in terms of their political commitments. So she's got to get out of Paris at certain points, and she gets involved with this guy, Gilbert Imlay. And Gilbert Imlay is an American. Americans were, in this conflict, they were neutral. And so Imlay is euphemistically described as an adventurer. He was more of a con artist and smuggler, kind of a roguish guy, if you want to, again, look at it in a positive way. And Mary Wollstonecraft really falls for him. And they wind up, she's a firm believer in marriage really isn't that important of a thing. Social conventions are holding women back. So they have a sexual relationship. And she actually gets registered as his wife at the American embassy, but only because that would protect her from the French revolutionaries if they wanted to go after her. And she is going to move to the countryside from Paris to escape the revolutionary violence. She'll come back to Paris, now pregnant, and then she'll move to The Hague. And there, Imlay will basically abandon her. I mean, they write letters back and forth, but he's a lot of the letters are like, hey, here's what's happening in the day. Here's what's happening with the maid. Here's what's happening with your daughter, Fanny. I really miss you. When are you going to come? You keep saying that you're going to come, but, I know that it's not just the war that's holding you back. And Imlay gives her, excuses and then just doesn't meet up with her. Meanwhile, she actually writes another book in that time called The Historical and Moral View of the French Revolution. And they get that back to her publisher, and it's quite interesting. She's taking a kind of what we nowadays call like a nuanced approach, and what we mean by that is she's actually like trying to be fair to the different sides, right? She's not taking the revolutionaries are always right side. She's not being like Burke, revolution is horrible and an affront to God and, against the natural order kind of thing. She's like, they went too far with this and that, but it is important. And, maybe there's some things we British people could learn from this. And then, back to her personal life, she goes back to London to track Imlay down. And she confronts him, and he rejects her. So she will end up making 2 suicide attempts. The first suicide attempt, Imlay actually saves her. And the second one will come after she does a little bit of work for him. So I don't know how he talked her into this, but she goes to Scandinavia to try to track down somebody who actually owes him money. Silver that Imlay was trying to get past the British blockade. And so she is essentially handling his business. She's got her daughter and a maid with her. So she's traveling as a woman on her own throughout these parts of the world that we now look at as, oh, wow, Scandinavia, wouldn't that be awesome to go to Denmark and Norway and Sweden? Look at how beautiful they are. And, the Danish have this word, hyggelig, everything is very comfortable. Well, it wasn't like that then. That would be like the butt end of Europe at that time. It was cold. There wasn't much of an economy compared to, France or England or even Spain. Life was hard there, and so she's going there, and she takes notes. She writes down all of this stuff, and she's going to publish eventually letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark that are kind of like a chronicle of all the stuff that she's going through. So then she comes back, and then Imlay, once again, is going to, leave her high and dry. And she's going to try to kill herself again. So this time she's thought it through. She's going to jump into the River Thames. She's wearing heavy clothing. She makes sure to get herself like totally soaked. And then she goes and jumps in the Thames. But somebody sees her and pulls her out, so she doesn't die. And she wrote a letter to Imlay before that saying, "Let my wrongs sleep with me. Very soon I will be at peace. May you never know by experience what you have made me endure. Should your sensibility ever awake, remorse will find its way to your heart, and in the midst of business and sensual pleasure, I shall appear before you, the victim of your deviation from rectitude." Right? He's really telling him off there. You're a bad guy, and I'm going to haunt you. Or I'm going to, as we say, I'm going to take up space rent free in your head. Right? You're not going to free yourself from me. So not the happiest life so far, but she's dealing with a lot of the challenges. And then she gets involved once again with Johnson's circle, and she meets William Godwin again. And now William Godwin has read letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and he has fallen in love with her as an author, as a brilliant mind. And he says of this book, now this is kind of interesting, the occasional harshness and ruggedness of character that diversify her Vindication of the Rights of Women here totally disappear. If there was ever a book calculated to make a man in love with its author, this appears to me to be this book. She speaks of her sorrows in a way that fills us with melancholy and dissolves us in tenderness. At the same time, she displays a genius which commands our admiration. Affliction had tempered her heart to a softness almost more than human, and the gentleness of her spirit seems precisely to accord with all the romance of unbounded attachment. Now, if you actually read the book, you might say, I don't know if I read the same book as William Godwin did. I think you probably read a good bit into it. But clearly, he fell in love with her because of that. And they get together, and they start, as we say, shacking up, or hooking up. And because he's actually an anarchist philosopher. He's actually written stuff against marriage, and she's not super into marriage either. But then she gets pregnant again, and so then he's like, well, we probably should get married, And then it comes to light that she wasn't even married to Imlay. Now he doesn't care, but some of the other people around them do. And they move in together. So they rent a house, and then he also rents an apartment 20 doors away, and sometimes stays there so that they can each have their independence of each other. Sometimes they actually send letters to each other while he's over at the other place. And their daughter, Mary, is born, the one who we know as the author of Frankenstein. And here's where the story, unfortunately, as far as her life, ends, because 11 days after the birth, she dies. And it appears that what ended up happening is the placenta broke apart, and she became infected. And, they just didn't have the resources and knowledge at the time to be able to treat that. It was quite common to get what was called childhood fever, meaning fever from having had children and some sort of complication. And so she dies 11 days later. She is able to see her daughter, but of course her daughter doesn't remember her at all. She only knows about her mother through her works and what William Godwin and others have to say about her. And now there's more to the story after this, particularly in relation to the vindication of the rights of women. But this might be a good place to take a little pause. I will say this. In her lifetime, she is known especially for that work, and it's massive. It's influence. People are talking about it. It's quite important. It's going to go into decline for reasons that I'll talk about in just a minute, shortly afterwards, that have to do with her, I won't say stupid husband, but there's certainly some sort of stupidity there, arguably. But any questions about like her life and the history that she's situated in? She's very involved in the affairs of her time. She's, traveling around. Doesn't go to America, but she goes to France. She goes to Portugal. She goes to the Nordic countries. Gets to see a lot of life. Yeah.
I think I gather you say that originally she was in favor of the French Revolution, or some parts of it, but that within 5 years, her history of it is bipartisan, would you say? And,
it's
bipartisan. Is it the guillotining of the Queen and the King?
Well, and so many others too. Yeah, I mean the royalty are one thing, and what they did to the Queen and all sorts of other nobles is pretty horrific, right? So she's getting to see a kind of barbarism that reflects our capacity for cruelty and what happens when you actually take order away and you don't replace it with something that can actually get people behind it. But I mean, the revolutionaries, I used the phrase, they ate themselves. She's also seeing what was called the terror, where even the people who were they were in charge and they were running the show, they would wind up getting guillotined. So yeah, she's not in favor of that sort of thing. She definitely thinks, and this is very clear in the Vindication of the Rights of Women, but also in that she thinks that, listen, this hereditary monarchy, that can't last. We've got to find something better that could actually be legitimate and offer, opportunities to people of all strata of society. She's not a big fan of militarism either. She actually says that, women wind up through their education getting deformed through miseducation, but that sailors and soldiers almost equally do as well because of their professions. So yeah, she's taking we could call it a moderate stance, right? A moderate stance, not bipartisan in the sense of these guys over here have something right. She thinks Burke is completely wrong about stuff, right? And the revolutionaries have some good ideas. She's like, nah, some of these radical people are really off base as well. But she wants something where, I guess we would, if we were going to use the terms of today, we could say that she was like a progressive who doesn't want to lose anything that we need to keep along the way, like a focus on virtue and mental development and becoming more civilized and all of those sorts of things, Did you have your hand up?
Yeah. I know in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she appeals to higher power and something like natural law, but in her life, she goes against what many Christian or at least theological to the extent of her region norms would have been. And I know she was raised Anglican and later interested in Unitarianism. What could her theological views at the time of the what Vindication of the Rights of Women would be described as?
That's a good question. I guess, I mean, she's not a deist, right? Which actually was a viable option at the time, but she's kind of closer to them than she would be to the, let's call them confessional churches, like the Anglican Church, which is kind of a mess at the time. It's a very broad, like messy thing. She's definitely in agreement with the deists that there is like a natural law that's written within us that we can, through using reason, bring out and then actually use to like govern our lives and organize society. She doesn't get into much theology about like how the world was created or anything like that. And you get the idea that God was more there, sort of like with, this is a common complaint about an earlier thinker, Rene Descartes. He brings God into the picture, gets what he wants out of God, and then let's move on to more mundane affairs, right? That's the sense I get from her. I mean, there's religious language. If she were writing today, like imagine we transplanted her to today, I don't think a lot of that religious language would be in there because we live in a different culture now where as soon as you invoke God, things, you've got different resonances, we could say. She doesn't believe the world is fair. That's very clear. But you don't have to think the world is fair to believe in God. But she thinks it can be improved. And that's really where her focus is, And she wants to, going back to the other thing about the French Revolution, so in a very broad sense, it's almost like you focus on the places where you can make the most improvement and get the biggest return on investment, you could say. So like improving how women are treated. Women are half the population, right? So you focus on changing their condition, that'll really do a lot. Whereas, I don't know, let's pick a much smaller demographic, philosophers. Things could be made easier for some philosophers, I suppose, but...
Well, or how about writers in general?
Yeah, there you go.
Freedom of speech issues.
Yeah.
Publication issues.
Okay, yeah. I mean, she's definitely for like freedom of speech and publication, but that's not like where her emphasis is going to be. Other people, there's also division of labor. Other people can be talking about that. She's really interested in like, what can we actually get the most out of? And I think she's right. Changing the attitudes and assumptions about women in European society at that time would, it did have massive effects. I mean, she was also interested in class. She thinks that the rich very easily become corrupt in their characters because they don't have to actually work for a living. She's pretty, she's not a huge fan of like what you might call the great unwashed masses, She's not romantic about that. She's sort of like, solidly bourgeois, we would say. But the bourgeois at that time was a progressive group politically, Not so much with respect to women, of course, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah.
Is she entirely self-educated?
No. I mean, she does go to the day school. I think, so that's actually a good question. So, a good bit of her education is reading other people's works, right? But she's not like entirely on her own. It's not like she just goes to the library. Who was that author who was like, you don't need to go to college, you just need a library card and time on your hands.
James Baldwin, maybe?
Maybe. And it seems to imply this kind of view where like you just do it all on your own. She has people to talk with. She has interlocutors. And so she's learning from them through argument, conversation. She's learning through her translating.
But not in a formal setting.
That's right, yeah. She doesn't go to like university. I mean, would she have benefited from doing that? Maybe. It kind of depends on who she studied with. I mean, I don't get the idea that the schools at the time were particularly great, hotbeds of learning for the most part. I mean, if she'd had the opportunity to go to Königsberg and study with Kant, that might have been quite nice for her, or meet the encyclopedists or people like that, I guess. But yeah, she didn't have that sort of opportunity. Well, let's talk about what happened to her, unfortunately. So this is a part of the story where things could have been so much better. I mean, dying sucks. So, and she was quite young, only 38 years old when she dies. She would have known, she's leaving her daughter behind with her somewhat impractical husband, William Godwin. And then, he's going to raise Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And her text, like it was said, the Vindication is really, really important. There's multiple printings of it. One way that you can tell that it really took off, there's a French translation. There's American editions, probably not actually licensed because it was common for American presses to take stuff and then just, not get copyright and publish it themselves. But that shows you that people were really reading it. And then the second and third parts she was supposed to be writing, they don't appear. There's some notes, but that's about it. And Godwin publishes those. And then Godwin screws things up. He publishes a work called The Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in it, he reveals, it's like a tell-all. And he thinks, oh, this is going to be great. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. We're in a new era. People will receive this. And so he mentions the fact that she's had a kid out of wedlock. That's a big no-no at the time. 2 suicide attempts, for what Godwin thought were perfectly understandable reasons. But other people are like, 2 suicide attempts. Clearly she's nutty. And his friends are like, you cannot publish this. This is going to destroy her reputation. And Godwin is an optimist, and he's like, no, people will understand. This will be great. And of course, everyone's like, yeah, we're not reading Mary Wollstonecraft anymore because look at what kind of lady she is. And so, for decades, there's some reading of it, but not that much. And she lives her work lives a kind of underground life. There are other people who are working through some of her ideas, but you don't really want to mention that you got them from Mary Wollstonecraft in Decent Society. By the 1830s, it's getting republished, but there's kind of like a bad book aura to it. This is a scandalous author. John Stuart Mill will make some of the same arguments in his book on the subjugation of women. And, it's really only in the late 19th century when she's starting to be appreciated again. And she becomes an influence on women writers and thinkers and activists. And so she gets kind of rediscovered, and she gets added to what we could call, a feminist canon or women philosophers canon, however you want to think about it. And so, I would say most often when she's recommended to somebody, it's in terms of feminism. You should read her because she is a feminist, not because she's just a great philosopher who happens to be a woman. And I don't think too many people read her other stuff at all. I think it's just mainly the Vindication, unfortunately. Yeah.
Feminist is sort of an anachronistic term. Would she be a feminist in the modern sense? I know she's important in what feminism is, but when we think of feminism today, some of her ideas like, some women, or at least most women, are naturally less intellectually, gifted or than men. would be something we consider.
I wouldn't use the word anachronistic. I would say ambiguous, meaning that it's a term that has multiple competing meanings, right? And I would say, let's say we understand it in terms of like different waves of feminism is how they often talk about it. So from like the perspective of third wave feminists, yeah, she's anachronistic. Not only does she occasionally make concessions like you're mentioning, which I think are just rhetorical. She doesn't actually believe that women have less intellectual ability. She's like writing to an audience where, because usually each time that she brings it up, she'll be like, well, even if they are, here's what we need to do, right? But, if you're a third wave feminist from the 90s onward, you're probably going to be like, yeah, see that? And then she is also, she's got a kind of conflicted attitude about sexuality that we'll talk about in a bit, which she didn't really follow herself. She's like, yeah, sexual love, not really where you should be focusing your attention. But you should try to have a marriage, and so that might be seen as anachronistic. But there are, one of the broad distinctions that I sometimes make when, not just with Wollstonecraft, but talking about feminism in like ethics classes, is between what we could call equality feminism, which is usually what first wave and second wave feminism are focused on, and then gender feminism, where it winds up being like men are bad, women are great, we need to celebrate everybody's achievements. Equality feminism, which she definitely just represents, is like, listen, men and women are not equal, and the inequalities keep getting perpetuated. We need to fix this. And that won't just be good for women, that'll also be good for men too, which is a case she explicitly makes. So it kind of depends on like which brand or variety of feminism you're thinking of today. I think if you feel yourself to be more cutting edge, she becomes less attractive, right? But if you're, I don't know, if you have a more restricted concept of it, then she's like solidly within the middle. I mean, she does get a lot of not hate, but criticism for being very bourgeois. Respectability is important, and you should strive to accumulate property so you can have a house and stuff like that, right? I think there's some people today who'd be like, oh, see, she's against the working class, but I don't think she's against the working class. She's from them. She just realizes it kind of sucks to not have security and steady income and things like that, and that we'd probably be better off if we had good jobs and didn't have to deform our minds to fit into whatever we have to do to make money. So, well, I think now's a good time to actually talk about some of the key ideas that she has that we mentioned a few of already. So I mentioned she's a virtue ethicist. This is actually how I got interested in her in the first place, because I do a lot of work on virtue ethics. And so when I first read the Vindication, you look at the first couple pages, and it's very, very clear that she fits into that long tradition in ethics. And another term that we can use that another ambiguous term today, perfectionism. Is it good to be a perfectionist? Is that something you want to hear said about you these days? It's a bad term for us, right? But perfectionism back then meant the idea that what we ought to do as human beings is to develop or to perfect, to bring to fruition the potential that we have, the capacities that we have. And so the more that you do that, the better you are. And that can be tied in with theology to some degree, right? God wants us not just to obey and all that. God wants us to develop our capacities. And a good part of that is our faculty of reason. We are the rational creatures. We're not perfectly rational. As a matter of fact, you go to philosophy department functions, and you're often surprised by how little studying philosophy has affected the people who do it, at least certain of them. But we should try to be rational, and that's part of how we're elevated above the other animals. And that can be misdirected in all sorts of ways, Knowledge is another really important thing for her. Some of it is experiential. She talks about struggling against the passions, right? We learn something as we deal with the crap that's inside of us making us do stupid things. Think about, and to talk about sexuality, think about when we all went through puberty and how confusing that was, and the stupid advice that we got from our peer group, and movies or TV shows or stuff on the internet. And our teachers may have been helpful, but sometimes weren't. Parents might have been helpful, or relatives. And what a confusion that was. Well, sometimes you got to figure things out by seeing what happens when you do something, and then you should hopefully draw some conclusions that will keep you out of trouble. And then she talks about virtue, and virtue is good dispositions and habits. These are part of human excellence. So she talks a lot about courage and honesty and justice. She'll also do analyses of gendered virtues, she says chastity shouldn't just be something for women. If it's a good thing, it needs to be good across the board. And there's a long tradition in virtue ethics of saying that the virtues are not actually gendered. It goes all the way back to Plato and the Republic, where he says men and women need all the same virtues. The Stoics also said that sort of thing. Musonius Rufus is very, very clear. He's got a couple lectures on why women need exactly the same education and exactly the same virtues as men do. So she's, in that line, and she thinks that men and women are equally capable of developing full human nature, but women historically haven't been able to do that. And as a matter of fact, most men haven't been able to do that at the time that she's writing too, because they have to work crappy jobs where they're not getting a chance to develop, and they're being abused by power structures with the rich and the powerful bossing them around. So she's interested in social development and the development of culture, as well as individual changes. And that's also in consonance with virtue ethics. Aristotle talks about the importance of changing society if you actually want to produce better individuals. Plato talked about that. The Stoics talked about that. So she's going to say, and this is what one of the handouts that I have for you, that there's kind of a vicious cycle that goes on. And it has to do with expectations. And we see this playing itself out, not just with respect to sex or gender, but also class, race, all sorts of, disability, all sorts of other things. So you start out in a present situation which is unbalanced. In the present that she's writing in, men have these opportunities to do some things. Women are being trained essentially to be like helpmates, domestic partners, to be charming for men, and they're not allowed to really develop except for some rare exceptions. And then if you bring people up that way, what are you going to do? Are you going to offer them opportunities for education or entering workspaces? No, women get stuck in the house and they don't get to go to school. And that's what the French Minister of Education was going to perpetuate. Now, if you do that, surprise, surprise, when women are actually offered the chance to step into the workplace, say, they don't perform as well, right? But that's because they didn't get the training and education and support that they would have had if they were men. And then that gets used as a justification for, oh yeah, see, we tried we gave them a chance. They didn't measure up. Better just to keep things the way they are, and it will just keep perpetuating itself over and over again. And like I said, you can see this with race. All the justifications. Black people, you can't really throw away education on them. What are you doing with some of us are old enough to remember this busing or desegregation. Oh, you shouldn't equalize things. Well, if you do that, you're setting up a situation that will keep perpetuating itself, I would say that we do this with other groups now in the present. So she says we need to somehow break this cycle. So how do you do that? Well, one way is to do things like write books, but it also has to do with how you run your household, or how you run a school. One of the things that I talk to my students, because I'm Generation X, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s and went to college in the 90s. And a lot of places still called female students co-eds at the time. That has completely dropped out of the culture. Would you hear anyone call a co-ed now, right? So because it's not used. That was the idea of co-ed, was that, well, we're letting women in. It's co-educational. They get a chance to take the seats that otherwise men would have. That took a couple generations to change things, to break through. Now, actually, for 2 generations, there are more women than men in higher education, and unfortunately, retention rates seem to be skewed as well. Women are staying in college, whereas a lot of men are dropping out. It'd be nice to have it like across the board, right? So you have to change things gradually, and it takes a lot of fighting against resistance, and maybe fixing something here, and then that can be a model for things over here. That's the only way to break this vicious cycle, in her view. You can't to go back to the French Revolution, right? You can't just like the Jacobins say, all right, kill all the bastards who've been taking everything. Let's get rid of these clergy as well, because they're getting in the way. And these country people who aren't getting with the program, we'll drown them or burn them. We'll have a little secular crusade against them. That's not what she thinks is the way to do it. You're just going to perpetuate the same kind of power dynamics. You're not going to make anything better. You've got to do it kind of gradually, which unfortunately a lot of people find kind of discouraging and boring. People often like excitement, but that's an important idea. This need to change that, and so education for her is the key way to do it. And education includes formal education, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. But it also includes what goes on in your workplace, right? What you're learning by participating in economic relations. So, having a largely integrated workplace like we do now in terms of gender, she would view as a good thing. The fact that there are still some jobs that are, very male-dominated. Some of them, interestingly, weren't always so. Computer programming, the early computer programming, lots of women involved. Then somehow it became a male-dominated thing, and now it's kind of swinging back a ways. We also learn at home, right? We learn from our parents. We learn from the attitudes that they have. We learn from how they treat us. So Mary's mom focusing on the boy in the family and kind of not giving as much attention to her, that sends a message, right? That's pretty important. So we want to change those things.
How many siblings did she have?
I don't remember. I want to say it's somewhere between 6 and 8. Big families were common back then, but so was dying, unfortunately. So, you notice her friend Fanny Blood dies really, really young. So it was kind of and we learn from that too, right? We learn by going through these traumatic incidents of people dying on us, that maybe we shouldn't put everything off for 30 years because it might not last that long. But she thinks that the biggest problem at her time is that women are being geared through their education in two ways that are problematic. One is they're learning these, well, like you were talking about, women, they're not as smart as men, they're not as capable, they are the weaker sex, they should just be protected. And this she even talks about well, you've read it, so physicality, right? Should they get exercise? And there's a lot of ideas at the time, women are so delicate, they need to wear lots of clothing and not move around very much, Well, and Wollstonecraft, that's a terrible idea, They should be they're not going to be as strong as the average man, granted, because male and female bodies are different, although, I've been to gyms where, actually, I'll tell you kind of a crazy story. I used to go to the Wisconsin Athletic Club, and I like to work out on the machines, so you got the little thing that goes in, and then you lift your weights. And, I can lift a good bit of weights, but I'm not like a huge bodybuilder. There was a little, probably 60 to 70-year-old Asian lady who would come in, and I would go to the machine after she'd used it, and not thinking about it, just start trying to do it. And she had it all the way down at the bottom. And I was like, holy crap. And I saw her actually doing the military press or the chest press. I was like, where are her muscles that she's able to do this? So there can be considerable variation, right? Mary Wollstonecraft thought that it was really important to cultivate our bodies and our minds equally, to not make excuses and say, oh, women can't do that sort of thing. The other big problem she saw had to do with sexuality and affections. Women were essentially being trained to be pleasing to men, right? Not to be appreciated for their intellect or their earning capacity or their athletic abilities or anything like that. They're supposed to be pretty, they're supposed to be charming, they're supposed to be the sort of thing that, she actually talks about this. She says, fondness is something that's appropriate to pets. It's not something that's appropriate to your wife. Not that you shouldn't like your wife or anything like that, right? But to treat them as if they're a lesser creature who isn't capable of much and really only exists to be an ornament or to make you feel good, that's a big problem. And I think this is still a message that's, at least in some areas of our society, still gets pushed out. Maybe not as much like back in the day when we joke about women going to college to get their MRS degree or things like that. But there's still a good bit of that. And oftentimes, it's not just the beauty industry or men doing it or the patriarchy. It's also women giving each other these messages, right? This is how you fit in. This is how you belong. So Wollstonecraft thought that needed to change. And then the third thing I'll mention, then we'll do some more Q&A. So she had some very definite ideas articulated in quite a few works, but especially in the Vindication, about what a marriage ought to look like. And for her, marriage, so this would be another thing where she might be viewed as anachronistic. Are feminists all about marriage these days? Not necessarily, right? But that was the institution at the time. So, and she is heteronormative, it's going to be a man and a woman. She doesn't worry about same-sex relations or anything like that, although she has some, pretty strong friendships with other women. So she thinks that in most marriages, it has its origin in sexual desire, the passion of love, as she calls it. And the problem with the passion of love is that it doesn't last that long. People are attracted to each other, they get married, and then you probably don't even have to wait for the 7-year itch, if that's all the basis. And then the partners may stop feeling love for each other, but they're still desiring romance, sex, that sort of thing, and so they'll go and seek it with somebody else. And at best, she says, while the wife feels love towards her husband, he feels fondness towards her because he doesn't treat her as an equal. She thought that a better marriage would still have its original motives in sexual desire. So it's not like you just go find somebody who you're not attracted to at all, and you're like, oh, they would make a great partner. You do have to have that spark, but as the passion of love fades, it gets replaced by other affections, specifically friendship. And friendship is not really possible between people who aren't equals, not in the full sense. So she thinks that you have to cultivate that, and they'll continue to feel sexual desire or love towards each other, but they'll do that rationally within certain limits. So it's not going to be honeymoon phase the entire time. And what they will develop is respect for each other. And respect at that time didn't mean just like not transgressing boundaries. It's a positive thing to have respect for another person. And she thinks that so that's a great ideal. What would it take to pull this off? So like I put here in the handout, unless both the man and the woman value and engage in both moral and intellectual development, neither is going to actually have enough to offer to the other person. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
This part on how they both need to be interested in moral and intellectual development, and then also how she kind of viewed the better marriage as friendship. Could this be tied back to some of her thoughts on virtue ethics and how, like in Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that, like, to be good friends, both people need to be engaged in each other's moral development, and then that friendship is to will the greatest good of the other, sort of?
That's important too. Yeah, she doesn't talk about it quite in those terms, but that wanting what is really genuinely good for the other person would have to be part of it, right? So if, let's say I went through a midlife crisis and I was like, my greatest good is to have the red sports car, I would hope that my wife and partner would say, that's really stupid, and you need to rethink that. First of all, our finances are not going to support that sort of thing, because we have other things we need to spend money on. But what the hell are you thinking, right? So sometimes challenging could be quite helpful. Do you want to say anything, Andy?
No, it's just funny, because between the two of us, I'm the one more likely to want the car.
Well, because you're a gearhead, yeah.
Yeah, but you would, if you decided to buy all the kittens in the world, for example. I was giggling about it,
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, you would be the one to get the
I'm too practical and you to do it.
the 57 Chevy, right? Or the
No.
Ford Mustang or something like
No,
that.
it's a Ferrari.
See, I don't even know. But yeah, so willing the genuine good for them would be central to this. And I think that would change over time, right? So I was joking about a midlife crisis, but maybe, it's different in your 60s together than it was in your 30s, right? There's another thing Aristotle says too. Aristotle does have this sort of hierarchical view. Women, according to him, and this is one of the boneheaded things that he says, don't have the same capacities to develop as men. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he's talking about the analogy between political regimes and types of friendship, he talks about the household, and he says, if women run it, then it becomes kind of oligarchical, and this is what happens when you have rich women who marry like middle class or poor men. They run the show. But if you have a woman who's genuinely capable of virtue, which he doesn't seem to think happens as often as it probably does, then she and her partner could have a relation of equality with each other, which would both be like aiming at cultivating virtue, and it would also be a friendship of pleasure because they like how they look and they enjoy each other's company. But he seems to think that's very rare. And Wollstonecraft is saying it doesn't have to be rare, right? This could be a blueprint for way better relationships. But, if you think about it, like, let's say you grew up in a household where your parents can't really stand each other, and you grow up on a street where most of the married people, they've got their separate lives. How would you figure this out, that it's a possibility, right? So yeah, that's an important thing. So she wants this to be no longer exceptions to the norm, but the norm itself. And the last thing that I'll say before we do a little bit more Q&A, before they kick us out. So did she exemplify this in her relationships with men? Not with Henry Fuseli. She's proposing essentially a platonic, throuple, but that's kind of strange. She didn't seem to consult his wife about it very much. Now she's fairly young at the time. And then she gets involved with Gilbert Imlay, and it would have been really nice if she'd had a friend who'd be like, that guy's bad news, don't get involved with him. But she falls for him very, very hard. And so, she tries to make him into a decent guy, but he's not a decent guy. She's definitely a better and more capable person than he is, or he could have handled his own business affairs. William Godwin, they seem to have viewed each other as genuine equals. There's real love between them. He's good to her, except for screwing up her reputation. Arguably, they wind up with what she's talking about, but she only gets to enjoy it for about a year and a half, unfortunately, Now, should she be faulted for not living up to everything that she was suggesting? I don't think so. I mean, what do you think about that?
I have not read more than 5 pages of her works.
Okay.
Directly, but I've read a lot about people. And I get the sense I get the implication from you that she's writing for a male audience mainly. She sees or hopes that men are the ones who probably have to start the change, start moving in that direction, though she's perfectly aware that women are capable of reading her work and also can improve themselves too if they try.
Yeah, I think you're probably right that the original first 5-year audience is, and not just for that, but also the Vindication of the Rights of Men and the reflections on the French Revolution. Yeah, it's probably more geared towards men than women as the intended audience. But I think she wants to see that change over time. Yeah. And she is also writing stuff that would be directed at a primarily female audience. The 2 novels that she writes, the early work. So, yeah. I mean, that is very interesting because I
think of any written piece of work being uniformly applicable to anybody.
Right.
She didn't have that luxury.
Yeah. And I think that she's probably still read more by women than men today. I mean, I assign her in my introduction to philosophy classes and ethics classes, but I'm a real outlier in that respect. It's usually only my female colleagues who are incorporating her works into their classes. So, yeah. But any other questions, ideas that you want to throw out there? Yeah.
So in where she talks about the kind of cycle where women are treated as, well, they're educated to be less morally adept or less intellectually adept as men, and they're socialized in their work to be less morally and intellectually adept than men. She talks a lot about hysteria and how women are this way, less adept, because they are socialized that their passions, their emotions should lead their intellectual thought, whereas men are socialized the opposite, that they should kind of not listen to or completely ignore feeling. is this perspective, at least that your intellectual thought shouldn't be led by your emotions, an outlier for this time? It seems to me to be kind of this is going to be kind of a weird take. It seemed to me to be kind of a Thomist perspective, something similar to how Aquinas thinks that you should have your emotions and they should inform your intellect.
Yes.
That you need to think about it, but once you process it, you need not to be ruled by those emotions.
Yeah, and I would say that like what you're calling the Thomist approach is like a whole family of approaches that are in the middle that way. So you have like let's put Immanuel Kant on one extreme, right? He's got that that famous letter to Maria Herbert, and he's got like passages. He's very much about duty, but if you like doing your duty, you're never sure that you're doing it for the right reason. Sentiment shouldn't enter into it at all. And, you read some of that stuff and you're like, this guy's kind of inhumane, And there's other people who distrust the emotions for other reasons. Some might be, it could have a religious justification. It could have all sorts of other things. And then you get like people, let's put it at the other extreme. You should always trust your emotions. We'll call that the romantic, the bad romantic thing, which her daughter seems to have like fell into a little bit, certainly hanging out with Shelley and his group, they were all into that. And then, you've got like, okay, so reason should be running the show, but your emotions are not in themselves bad. They can certainly go the wrong way. Ultimately you want to have like an integrated approach to it where your emotions are doing what they ought to do. So for example, Thomas Aquinas thinks that anger is not always a bad thing. We got to be really careful with it, but it's a way of dealing with what he calls the difficult good, right? Goods that require opposition, and sometimes it's a way to enforce justice. We can go wrong with it, and that's why reason is so important. But you don't want to be just, a computer. You don't want to strip your emotions away. And so she fits right within that, I would say. And I would say most virtue ethicists, most traditions of virtue ethics are trying to bring about that integration. The Stoics would be not all the way over where Kant is, because they do recognize some good emotions. Even Kant recognizes a good emotion. What does he call it? Moral something or other. I'm blanking on it. But, it's something that you feel when you're actually motivated the right way. But the Stoics would be more towards Kant than Aristotle or Plato or Wollstonecraft or Thomas for that matter. So, yeah. And that means you've got to know your emotions, right? What we call emotional intelligence today is really important. Actually being able to figure out what the hell am I feeling and why am I feeling it, and am I off base in feeling it? Am I feeling it too strongly? That's all stuff that could be coming out of Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or Plato or Plutarch, So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I want to go back to the question that you asked. You asked whether her relationships.
Oh, the inconsistency.
So I'll give you my thought, and then I want to know yours.
Okay.
My thought is, I'd say the first one, the throuple, that's inconsistent. That doesn't work. The second one, I have a tougher time with that, because you talked about the emotions. You talked about the emotions, rationality versus the emotions, and I could see, maybe the child out of wedlock, but just falling for the adventure, and then the emotions taking over the rationality. You want to be, the perfect marriage, at least what she was talking about. I could see how that could trip you up. So, what would your thoughts be?
Actually, I was just thinking that Imlay probably was turning on the charm too, right? And so, she probably thought he was a better guy than he was. We could fault her for getting that wrong, but I don't know. Unless I don't actually think we have enough clear documentation from the time to say she should have done her due diligence better or something like that. I think she probably was hoping that he would measure up in ways that he didn't. And I mean, there's lots of relationships where you almost like hope or project onto the other person, thinking that if you do that, they'll like respond properly, and then they don't. Some of them do, you know. We even have movies where that happens. Although we shouldn't take those as guides. You know, the whole inconsistency thing. So Seneca has this discussion On the Happy Life, where he talks about people who fault philosophers because the philosophers don't entirely measure up to their own doctrine, right? And Seneca says, first off, who the hell ever said that they would, right? Did they say, you know, did Aristotle say, I have all the virtues? No, he doesn't in his works, you know? Did Socrates tell you that he was a perfectly developed individual? No. So what we should be concerned with is less like an on-off switch and more like think about a dimmer switch or a continuum. How far are they away from their ideals? Are they radically inconsistent with it? Okay, there's a problem then, right? If I'm saying something like, you know, wealth doesn't matter at all, only virtue is important, and then you see me over here doing tawdry things to make a buck that are clearly unvirtuous, you'd be like, hey, there's an inconsistency there, and that's a bad inconsistency. If I'm trying to be a virtuous person, and I do say that, you know, wealth really is not that important. It's a lesser good, or as the Stoics would say, an indifferent. But every once in a while, I cut a corner or something like that in a very small way. Okay, well, that's okay. You know, it'd be better if I wasn't that way. So this is like the perfectionism. Perfectionism in the bad sense means everybody has to measure up all the time. It should be understood as like it's a process. We're trying to get better and better. And we could say this with relationships. Are we perfect lovers and carers and friends and respecters of our partners? Probably not. But that doesn't mean that the fact that we hold those as important and ideals is all just window dressing or made up, you know. So I'm inclined to cut her some slack. I'm also, because I'm older, I'd be curious too to see what a younger person thinks of this. So I think when I was younger, I probably would have been less forgiving of these things. But now, you know, I look at the fact that she was only 38 when she died, right? And she's considerably younger when she's proposing this thing to Fuseli and getting involved with Imlay. I'm inclined to cut her more slack as a 55-year-old, which I'm going to be in a few days, than I probably would have been when I was a 25-year-old. Now, what do you think? You're a young person. Does it make a difference?
I think that part of her perspective, I think, and I could be wrong, was that you learn both from, you know, your formal education, your classroom, and from experience.
That's right,
So you could take into account, oh, she died very young. So some of the romantic relationships you had may have not followed her principles completely, but she was learning from experience as she built those principles. She had 4 experiences with people like Imlay and, I forgot the name of the other guy.
Godwin?
Yeah.
Or
No.
Fuseli. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Where she had like 4 experience and she learned from that, this isn't how it's supposed to work.
There you go, yeah.
But I also think, as a virtue ethicist, if she's trying to make virtues habits, she should have practiced it more thoroughly. Or you could, and then I kind of contradict myself, you could take the opposite and say a habit isn't perfect all the time.
Oh, yeah.
You're striving for perfection, but you're not going to make it every single time.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and it takes a while to build habits, right? We're often in that in-between where we're directed towards the good, but we know that we're not quite measuring up to it, you know? And then we have to fight like the temptations to like try to brush that under the rug and say, oh no, it's all fine, you know, I'm doing a great job. and be honest with ourselves, which is not always fun, right?
When did you write actually about marriage? When?
Oh, I mean, it's
when in the timeline?
Oh, I mean, it's there in the Vindication of the Rights of Women. I mean, it's touched on in earlier stuff. Like in her novels, the guys are kind of bad. And she saw her sister have a terrible, terrible marriage. You know, she had to help get her sister out of it. And I'm sure there were lots of other examples that she could have drawn upon from people on her street. But she also got to see some good marriages, not her own parents, but the Bloods and some of the other people that she encountered. You know, and that's education too, right? Getting to see other people.
But she primarily developed that for these particular relationships that we're talking.
Do you mean the? The fuller notion of it. After Fuseli, I would say like contemporaneous with Imlay, you know, and then it gets realized with Godwin, you know, later on when she's finally able to have that. I mean, it's too bad because they could have been together for 30 years, you know. Who knows what she was supposed to be working on part 2 and part 3 of A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Who knows what she would have actually produced, you know? And it may have drawn on experience of like, now I finally have a real partner, you know? That could have been quite interesting, but we'll never know, you know? What we do know is he wasn't very prudent. Prudence is a virtue. Yeah. So. What? Any other questions or? All right. Well, we'll wrap up because I know they're going to boot us out before too long. But thanks for your questions and comments.